Good evening and welcome to Writers on Writing. I'm your host, Dr. Brenda Green, Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature and Chair of the English Department at Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. And I'm very, very pleased to have with me on the phone today a colleague from another CUNY college, Brooklyn, Professor Ron Howell. Good evening.
Good evening. What a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you and to talk about this passion. The passion that with which you wrote this biography of your late grandfather, Bertram Baker. Just to share with our listening audience, Ron Howell is a journalist who's written extensively about the Caribbean, Latin America, and New York City. He's also Associate Professor of Journalism at Brooklyn College and author of 100 Jobs, a panorama of work in the American city. His most recent book, which just came out in the fall, is Boss of Black Brooklyn, The Life and Times of Bertram L. Baker. Yes, so this is, I know it is a labor of love for you. So
Yes.
Just to share, you've been at journalism for quite some time. What motivated you to go into journalism? Because you do tell this story using the perspective of a journalist. So what motivated you to go into journalism first, and then we'll get into more of the book, this fascinating book.
Oh, that's so interesting that you would put that question there at the beginning and come up with it at all. I've had friends who have known me for decades who have, I was about to say suggested, but they've come out and said, even finger pointing, that the book is Freudian in many ways, and in some senses I've even felt that my decision to become a journalist had to do with my grandfather and reacting to him as a politician. I guess I'd have to sit down on a couch with a psychiatrist to discuss that and other things. But there are times when I felt that, I have a deep suspicion of elected officials, and I think it's true of many journalists. I mean, you listen to the cable stations, and it's, it comes out, and with newspaper reporters as well. And there are times I think my embrace of journalism was in large part a reaction to growing up in a household where I saw so many politicians and judges. I think that's true, and fortunately, it came together in a way that I hope is pleasing to his spirit, because there were times we were very much at odds.
Right. I think that's what really, as I've said to you previously, what makes this book really unique and has a special niche is the personal stories you're given. And you're so honest and giving those backstories. I just felt like I just was in a room with you, just listening to you talk, as you interjected. Okay, the author's story, the author's perspective. And I think that's what really helps to engage the reader and to make it meaningful. So you're not just reading a biography of the Black boss. You're getting this perspective from someone who knew him intimately and who lived in his home and who was surrounded by that. And then, of course, I know you as a colleague, so I'm feeling like I'm getting all of these sides of you and understanding you more as the journalist, as the professor, as the person just concerned with politics and issues around social justice. I just saw another perspective of you, and I think that's why I wanted to begin with that question.
Very, very much appreciated. did reach a point in my early 20s when I was bouncing around from job to job, and I started keeping a diary and taking notes, and eventually decided that was the way to go for me. I also applied to law school, which I think my grandfather would have loved and probably thought was natural for me, because he thought the world was made of doctors and lawyers. And there came a point in the mid '70s when, and this was after having been accepted at law school at NYU Law School. I looked at it, the letter, and just said, no, I can't do it. It's not really me deep down inside. And there's pretty much no looking back from then. What is that for? Well, more than 40 years. Let's just put it that way. And I've called myself a journalist ever since then. But I've had to admit that there's something about biography writing, and I guess it's a love of history. I was, in fact, a history major in college, and some of my best pieces, the ones that interested me most, were pieces that look back in time, especially in New York history. And also, I think every writer wants to, explore herself or himself and try to understand himself better, and thereby come to a better positioning of oneself in the world. But that was always beneath the surface for me, because journalists are always saying that, well, they have to be objective.
Right, but you have a hard. You were not total. You're not as objective, no. And I do believe that no matter how hard you try, there always will be components, as you said, of writing that's autobiographical. And I think if you had been as a journalist, you've been really in the tradition of the activist journalist. You would have been the activist lawyer, and in writing this book, you're the activist biographer. You're not afraid you don't walk away from any controversy, and you embraced a lot of dimensions. So let's get into the book. So why was it important to tell the story of Bertram L. Baker?
Well, I was
the boss of Black Brooklyn.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I loved the alliteration of that. When the title came to my mind, I said, boy, that's going to do it. Such a great title. I don't have to be concerned about what's in the pages. but I did have to be somewhat concerned. It was an impulse to, as I said, I do think the historian is there in me. I had written a piece that I think was one of my favorite over the years about the first black graduate of CUNY, who was William Green, graduated from City College in 1884. And I just delved into it for a year, and it meant so much to me, and I was able to uncover so much about him. But I think that I've also come to see myself as being in my spirit Brooklyn. It's Brooklyn is in my soul, in my personality, and I guess it was an acknowledging of that, and a feeling that, well, there's nothing wrong in exploring, like, where did that come from? And it was pretty clear that it came from my grandparents, and their parents too, because I learned a little bit about my great grandfather, well, both of them, and great grandmothers, and they were about Brooklyn in the early 1900s. And I said, I really, really need to know more about this. So it was really kind of an exploration, almost the kind that someone in anthropology does when he's going in and just digging up, physically digging up and trying to come up with just these things that you find from 100 years ago. And it felt natural. It felt natural, and it was the coming together of those two desires to explore history and reach into oneself which is
So,
what I was
right.
doing.
So we continue to go back to that. So it's autobiographical and exploring Black Brooklyn. When you think about Bertram Baker, what do you want the listeners and the listeners on this show and your readers to know about Bertram Baker? I was struck by your comparison of him to both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. You don't normally see someone taking taking one person and having both attitudes and qualities represented in that one person. So how would you describe him, and what do you want people to know about him?
I suppose what I'd like people to know, maybe especially young people, that while especially I guess coming up in the 60s and 70s, used to hear the word compromise, and you turn your nose up at someone you think is a compromiser. But I guess I came to feel, looking at his life, that making it from day to day, especially as you're going down the path of a career, is in fact about compromise. I also came to learn that my sense of Booker T. Washington was just very different from his, and I suspect very different from many who came up in his my grandfather's era in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. I remember, as I was researching, coming up on an article. As I recall, it was either the Age, the New York Age, or the Amsterdam, because the Times and the Daily News and even the Eagle wouldn't have explored this, but it had Bertram Baker speaking to a group, and I think it was the Y in Brooklyn, and he did a recitation of Booker T. Washington's, lay down your bucket, in the water speech, which really came to sort of epitomize Booker T. Washington for what it said about, stand where you are and try to be friends with the people around you. And there was a time in the 60s when I guess I thought that meant, sometimes the word we use is, playing up to or sucking up to someone when that person has been, treating you so harshly. But in fact, there was a great deal of the art of survival in it, too. And I came to understand that about my grandfather. I did title one of the chapters Master of Compromise. And I did have Booker T. Washington in mind because they called him the Great Compromiser. And there are a lot of people who hated him for that reason. But in fact, he was respected by many.
But you also say that he agitated in the same way that W.E.B. Du Bois did.
Yes, very much so. There were a lot of, especially Black Brooklyn politicians who came up in the 60s and 70s and would have seen Bertram Baker as a compromiser. And in fact, I guess I did too when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, which was, caused problems between us because I just thought he was on the wrong side. But, in looking into his life, I came to feel some guilt about things he said and did that really showed him to be, almost by nature tougher, I think, than I, was and am by birth.
So give us some examples of that. What would be an example of that?
He worked for a lighting fixture company in Brooklyn in the early 20s. Very much, the past doesn't exist anymore, and it was run by Irish Brooklynites, and they gave him a job keeping books there. And I guess they liked the way he talked. It was a very kind of British way that he brought with him from Nevis. And I think that helped him out quite a bit when he was dealing, especially with the Irish who had been here and had speaking English for so long. But there came a time when they hired someone and started to give that other person tasks that my grandfather thought was were rightly his, and also a salary that was higher. And he, right there in the office, stood on a chair and denounced them and said he was not going to work for them anymore, and he left. And he wound up speaking to one of them again and called him a dirty dog to his face. And, of course, he never worked for them again, but that very much sort of characterized who he was. And I saw some of it myself as a child, yelling at white police officers. And I guess it didn't mean that much because I thought of my grandfather as just, as someone said, gruff. I mean, some of my friends would come over and he'd order us to do things, and my friend would say, "Your grandfather is mean." And my attitude was, you're right. He's mean, and I have to live with it. It's just, we deal with what we're given. But there was a time we were at Prospect. He started a little league for boys in Bedford-Stuyvesant. The little league was ages 9 through 12, and then there was a pony league, which stood for Protect Our Nation's Youth, which was 13, and there were 13 and 14. And I played, in the leagues. And I know he was concerned because a lot of those guys were really tough. And my grandma said, "Well, are you really going to be out there with those?" And I said, "Hey, I'm in the Navy. These are my friends, And, so I came up in the Little League and Pony League. And we had it was like a summer gathering and met at Alley Pond Park out in Queens. And I'll never forget, we were there. And next thing you know, my grandfather was yelling at everybody to come follow him. And we get to this open area, and there are two white cops each on a horse, and two of the leaguers. I guess were 14, 15 in the Pony League at the time, and the cops had accused them of, touching a girl or saying things to her that I guess they were interpreting as flirtatious. And the presumption was that the girl was white, although the girl wasn't there. And they brought him back. They brought, and they were following the guys, and they were on their horses. And my grandfather just threw a fit, asking them what they were doing with these decent boys who were on his baseball teams, and he wanted their badge numbers, and they were going to hear from him, and they were going to hear from others in the assembly, and he was going to, make sure that their commander, and everybody was just stunned silent, and I don't even know what the immediate aftermath was because, frankly, I kind of put it out of my head after that. But, obviously everyone else there remembered it too, and it wasn't the only time I'd seen him yell at a...
Right. Well, he wouldn't have gotten to be the black boss of Brooklyn if he didn't have those two sides. Talk a little bit about his relationship with the Democratic Party.
Yes.
Which was not the party that people in the early 1930s were really aligned with. Talk about how that evolved.
Yes. I do think that made all the difference at the beginning in the relative ease with which he was able to enter the room and then step on the ladder and climb it because, he made his first outreach in 1924, right after becoming a citizen, because he was technically a British citizen because Nevis, where he came from, was a British colony. So he became a citizen and right away went to the Democratic Club, which is on Gates Avenue, which everybody in Bed-Stuy was on Gates Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
And he took on the jobs that entry-level folks with aspirations in politics do, which is collecting signatures of people in the neighborhood, in your district, because you're assigned an area within the assembly district, election districts. And your job is to, get signatures, and for them to be valid, and it meant knowing the people in the community. And so many of the black folks, because that was, the where he was canvassing, which was Throop Avenue, Jefferson Avenue, and large numbers of them were black. It was becoming blacker, but there were cohesive areas that were black. And he talked about going to this one house on Jefferson Avenue, where he knocked on the door. A lady came to the door, and he told them told her why he was there. And she said, "Young man, I'm ashamed of you." She said, "I was born a Republican. I'm a Republican now, and I'll be a Republican when I die." And she slammed the door in his face. And he told that, and he laughed, but he was also just indicating how difficult it was because, it wasn't that far removed from slavery. You figure what, 50, 60 years, which is, that meant that there were a lot of people alive who had been slaves. But I think what happened with some of the West Indians, they didn't have the gut, visceral connection with slavery. They knew when they were being insulted, and they had this strong sense of being black and denied certain things, but they didn't have the gut connection to the Republican Party, and they saw that the power in Brooklyn was with the Democratic Party, and
Right.
they
So
joined
you
it.
right. You have to look at those who came up from the South were staunch Republicans because the Democratic Party was comprised around that time of those who were part of many who were the members of the Ku Klux Klan,
Yes.
that enforced the Jim Crow. So you're correct in terms of what happened with those who came to this country, how they would embrace the Democratic Party and not have that history, as you said, and looking at the party that in the North seemed to be more open with
Yes.
respect to taking them in. So, as we come to a close, can you share, you discussed some of the highlights, but part of what this book does is to bring together so many of the backstories. You have the clubs, the Prince Masons, you have class issues, you have immigration, you bring all of these together in the story. So a highlight of his career, what was one of the major highlights of his career? Because I think this story impacts Black Brooklyn politics in many ways. You want to just share one of the highlights?
One was the passing of the Metcalf-Baker
Right.
bill. I distinctly remember hearing it when I was a child as the Baker-Metcalf bill, with his name coming first. But in fact, it was tradition for the senator to be first, and it was Senator George Metcalf who sponsored it in the Senate, and Bertram Baker did so in the Assembly. And they pushed it through, and it was a big deal at the time, and they had black folks from Brooklyn going up to Albany to advocate for it, and eventually went through. The legislation was signed by the governor, Averill Harriman, in 1956, and it made it illegal to discriminate in the sale or rental of housing, though you have to point out that it's certain kinds of housing, that it had to be more than 2 stories, and also, importantly, it had to have government financial assistance. And so it was a big deal at the time, and it was strengthened throughout the late 50s and early 60s. And it was an era of hope, because you look at where we are now and you say, well, my goodness, what did it do? We were talking about the end of segregation, but then again, 1954, people thought that maybe segregation in the schools was going to end with Brown versus Board. And it was the same time. That was 54, and this was 56. But it was a big deal, and there were many things for him among his accomplishments, but that would have been at the top or very near the top for him. And now in 2018, I guess there would be some great disappointment at where we stand in the city and the country. But hopefully he still also has a great deal of the pride that I and many feel he rightly deserves.
Well, as you say, in order, if we don't understand our past, we're bound to repeat it. So you've done a wonderful job of documenting the story and also giving us the story of Black Brooklyn politics and what it takes to be, what it means and takes to be political and to be a politician. Politics rules everything. We are at the end, so just a closing message to our students and our listeners. What message do you have in your role as a journalist and for this book? We've been talking about Boss of Black Brooklyn, The Life and Times of Bertram L. Baker. Do you have a message for our students and our listening audience about either from your role as a journalist or why it's important to read this book?
Well, from the book, it's to love your ancestors, especially the ones you were closest to, parents and grandparents. Find them, and if there were problems with them, try to overcome any obstacles there. And of course, with the children, try to be true to them. I grew up in my grandfather's house. My father had problems with alcohol, and I came to feel that my grandfather rescued me, and maybe that was what really was underlying everything in the book. That things would have been very different for me if it were not for a grandfather who took me into his house.
Right, that really comes across. Thank you for taking the time to tell this story, this labor of love for you. I want to encourage our listening audience to go out and purchase Boss of Black Brooklyn, The Life and Times of Bertram L. Baker, particularly if you want to understand politics or you just want to know more about the history of Brooklyn. It's a book that can be used in any public administration or political science class. And we've been on the phone with Professor Ron Howell. This has been Writers on Writing. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. I want to thank my engineer, Fritz Richardson, and thank you again, Professor Howell.
And thank you for all that you do. It's much appreciated.
You're welcome. All right, take care. All right.